Before we start, thank you to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at kyndryl.com. Our guest bets you have felt it yourself in your own life and in your own career. Maybe it was a day your favorite company killed the product you and everyone else loved, or when your own company canceled its innovation products to help make the quarter, or when you watched helplessly as the professional CEO brought in to replace the founder drove the company into the ground, or when leadership changed and the mission became just words on a website. We lack the vocabulary to call it what it really is. Mission drift, that sounds like a navigation error. Bureaucracy sounds like paperwork. Neither captures the gut punch of betrayal when someone precious is corroded beyond recognition. So our guest calls it by a simple old-fashioned name. He calls it corruption. He is with us to address the challenge and offer solutions. He is literally a man on a mission. We welcome the author of Incorruptible, Why Good Companies Go Bad and How Great Companies Stay Great. Eric Ries, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you on the show. I have way less time with Eric than I would like, and I was going to do a golden goose on him and try to get as much time out of him as possible. It's just not possible with the mission work that he's doing. I thought I'd tee you up this way, Eric. Clay Christensen, who you know well, used to speak of former classmates at Harvard Business School, people like Jeffrey Skilling of Enron, Rhodes Scholars too, that he was scholars with, and how they ended up unhappy or in some kind of financial or personal scandal. And he wrote once, "I know for sure that none of these people graduated with a deliberate strategy to get divorced or lose touch with their children, much less to end up in jail. Yet this is exactly the strategy that too many of them ended up implementing." And I thought that was a perfect setup to what you see, because your work, you've brought it even further and you're giving a system and a blueprint for people to manage this. But let's first talk about what the problem is.
Oh gosh, and yeah, we all miss Clay so much. It's such a loss when he passed away, and you know, the torch of his work needs to be passed to a new generation to try to figure out how can we help turn this around, because we are in the midst of an era where the dominant best practices that we are teaching leaders about leadership, about how companies should be built, structured, and governed, a lot of them are value destroying. And this is kind of hard for people to imagine. Like, how could it be that they're the best practices for a reason, but the reason is often not a good one? I witnessed this myself. I personally know quite a few people, as Clay did, who wound up incredibly rich and totally miserable or worse. And you see people sometimes ask me, like, why are these billionaires having like a public mental breakdown every day on social media? If they're so rich, why don't they just go buy an island and like be happy? It's like, well, you know, you might have heard from ancient wisdom that money does not buy you happiness. And here we see that evidence over and over again. But I think there's something particular to the unhappiness that we're seeing now. And Clay, of course, had his finger right on the pulse of it. That we are teaching people a strategy, a specific way of making money via value extraction, via value destruction. That does work. That's why it's dangerous. But although you can make money like that, it's very hard to find satisfaction with that. And it's very difficult even to just create any kind of sustainable value creation with those tools. Ultimately, they are short-term in nature. And so they tend to plant the seeds of their own destruction. And that's how people wind up in jail. That's how people wind up with all kinds of moral compromises, because they're having to do more and more and more and more, like a drug addict, chasing the next high, chasing the next fix. It's ultimately quite sad.
You start with the story of the professor, and it sets up the challenge so brilliantly. And to tee you up, I'm going to just quote a little piece here. You say, like many builders, he was not interested in making money by any means necessary. He wanted his company to prosper by creating a product that was useful, trustworthy, and healing to customers. In today's hyper-financialized economy, these simple aspirations have become radical acts. Every one of them has become expendable, too often sacrificed on the altar of growth, share price, and short-term returns. Apart from how I love how you've written that.
Oh, thank you.
I love the story of the professor, and let's give the context because it really sets up the challenge.
Yeah, most people don't realize how revolutionary their own ideas are because they think, well, I'm just making a company to make money. And it's like, oh, really? Money by any means necessary? Sure. That's what will give me leverage. So let me do the other things I want to do. I was like, yeah, but what if somebody finds a way? Let's say you value quality, or in this case, the professor, he was building a health company that was doing research that would ultimately lead to incredible breakthrough therapies using AI. And, he had been indoctrinated into the for-profit ideology like all of us had, that all ways of making money are basically just as good as any other, even though in his heart, he felt what I call the builder's intuition, that the best way to make money is actually to create more value than you capture. And other ways of making money are suspicious or maybe even bad. So he would have investors who would say to him, well, why don't you worry about that stuff later? Just make the technology work, get to product market fit. If you're like too worried about how you're going to make money or the different ways, if you're worried about that stuff, like maybe you're not very serious about being business. Maybe you should go back to academia. But meanwhile, his employees, he's trying to hire the most talented researchers on the planet. And they have real questions for him about, well, is this going to be used to create long-term value or something terrible? And he would say, but don't worry, I have such good intentions. And that was not getting the job done. They're like, well, what does that matter? Aren't we a for-profit company? Aren't we going to have investors? What if the investors pressure you to do something bad? Well, I'll resist. That's not very satisfying. What if they fire you? Oh yeah, what about that? So he was feeling really trapped. Now it happened to be, and of course in the book I tell this in dramatic fashion as best I can, that I was having this conversation with the professor at the same time as I was going to commemorate a founder who was like 14 years into his journey. He had tremendous success. I mean, he had made more money for his investors than they could spend in 5 lifetimes. Okay. He really had been a very successful entrepreneur. And yet his board had fired him at the earliest possible opportunity because for all the money he made them, it wasn't enough. They wanted more. So we were at this event and I'm explaining to the professor, I'm going to this event. Look, there's like 1,000 people here. We're all celebrating this founder. People had flown in from all over the country to see him. Yeah, I saw people who had been laid off who came back to celebrate him. And the professor's like, wow, what respect. That's just the kind of company I want to build. I'm like, man, you are not listening to me. He doesn't work there anymore. This is not a party. It's a wake. And he's like, oh my God, did somebody die? Nobody died. Oh, did the company go bankrupt? No, the company's not. I was like, no, everything's fine except something really precious has been lost. And none of us quite know what to call it. And I remember being at that party and everyone being like, yeah, do we trust this company anymore? No. And the new CEO is not a bad guy. But what good are the new CEO's promises when he could be fired at any time? So there's this loss, this corruption that is all over our economy. And the professor was starting to get really worried. He's like, wait a minute, are you saying that's going to be me someday? I'm like, that's what I'm trying to tell you. And he asked me the question that kind of launches the whole book. He said, is it even possible to build an incorruptible company? Or is this corruption inevitable? And I was like, well, the good news is, although most people think it's impossible, I disagree. I think it is possible to do this. But the bad news is you've already taken steps in the wrong direction because you have already bought in to these so-called best practices. And you have now incorporated and built a company that is structurally weak to the same forces that led to the demise of this and so many other great companies. So that's really the project of the book, is to identify the why. How do we get into this mess? Why is it happening this way? Where do these best practices come from and what's wrong with them? We have a lot of really great evidence, but far more important, to lay out the blueprint. If you want to build an organization that can resist this corruption for the long term, that can actually create quality or health or whatever you care about, whatever revolutionary idea you have, we want to protect and defend it. We know how to do it. We have the research, we have the case studies. But in order to do it, we're going to have to go on a journey where we reject so many of the so-called best practices we've all been indoctrinated to believe in.
Beautiful, man. Beautiful job of the professor. Nice setup as well, like you do inside the book. And I want to tell our audience, you got to read the book to really get a grasp of the setup is beautiful in part 1, the problem, and then the solutions as well. But you really have to settle down. And there's an accompanying website I'm going to link to. as well for people, and QR codes, just to dive a little bit more into the challenge. I don't know if you've ever been there. I worked for a company once, and at one stage, the owner was quite malignant, this guy. And he made me feel, because I was being moral and I wanted to do right by my family, all those things we talked about with the Clay Christensen message at the start, that he made me think, well, maybe I just need to knuckle down and be more business-like. And you bring this up. You say, when you talk to investors, they say to CEOs like this or founders like this or builders like this, oh, well, you're just not very serious about business, because if you were, you'd do what I tell you, because I know how to build businesses. And in there's this moment of Dorian Gray where you're like, do I put the portrait up in the attic here and knuckle down and be business-like and give up on that gut feeling of doing the right thing?
So many people compromise in these situations and wind up with a company that is undifferentiated and mediocre because they are being pulled down by this financial gravity, I call it, this force that unless you actively resist it will turn your company the same as every other company. The way we know that it's a force is think about all the big companies you know that are all the same. You know, they put out the same anodyne press releases. They jump on the same stupid bandwagons. They're all sucking into the same social contagion of, whatever the latest trendy thing is. They are weak. And one of the goals of the book is to introduce this idea that organizations can be not just good or bad, not just, evil or not evil, not just growing fast or not fast, but they can be strong or weak. There's an idea of organizational strength that is required if you want to actually sustain some kind of mission or purpose over longer periods of time. And in order to do that, we have to be willing to take our own beliefs and values seriously, so they don't just become paper on a wall, but they become the true convictions, the ethos, the character of the whole organization.
You're seeing this yourself. So when you go against the flow, when you introduce a system that might replace or threaten the existing systems, you come against huge resistance, and the status quo by its very nature can be nasty and try to drag you down. And you experience this with your brilliant project, and I want to really share this one as well, the LTSE, the Long-Term Stock Exchange, and how that was welcomed into the industry.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very proud of our work on the Long-Term Stock Exchange. For those who don't know, it is the first new national securities exchange. So here in the U.S., the same legal kind of thing as the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ. The first one of its kind since the creation of the NASDAQ 50 years ago. So it was quite the ambitious and difficult undertaking. Now, and I don't want to get into the arcana of exchange stuff unless people are interested. We obviously do a whole separate episode just on how to bring long-term thinking back into the public market. But what you have to know about this is so many things in our modern economy are all the same. I said all these companies all behave the same. Everyone's got the same dumb click-through license agreement that nobody reads, or everyone's doing an extractive business practice, or they're laying people off, or whatever the thing is. When you see unanimity or consistency, you ask people, why is everything the way that it is? People say, well, that's the invisible hand of the market. It must be, because if it wasn't, competitive pressure would force it to be something else. Therefore, the market has spoken. This must be the best. That's where a lot of our best practices come from. I thought so too. And I had wondered, stock exchanges, all the US stock exchanges all have the same listing standards. I wonder why. Must be because that is the best. I don't know. They don't seem very good to me. I think we could do better. So I thought, let's build a new stock exchange. Hard though that is, let's get it approved by the SEC. Let's go compete with new listing standards compared to the incumbent exchanges. Okay. And we get to a certain point, I tell the story in the book, where we were almost about to succeed. We had our first listings lined up. We were about to get our regulatory approval. And all of a sudden, this kind of group comes together to put a stop to what we're doing. And they call me up and they're like, look, we just think what you're doing is bad. It's inevitably going to fail. We're not going to allow it to go forward. And I was very naive. I said, look, this is America. If we're going to fail, what's the big deal? Let us fail. We're a market economy. Let us fail. I said, well, your failure, you might be drawing attention away from other things that we like even better than you. So we're not going to let this happen. I was very overconfident that we could overcome that, but I was so wrong. Anyway, I won't belabor the whole story, but they started to put pressure on our vendors to abandon us. So it wasn't just like oppose our government application. They didn't do anything out in the open. They would just call the CEO of anybody we worked with and say, listen, if you partner with this company, other things that you need more than that, we're going to deny you. You need us for other things. So don't waste your political capital on this. Anyway, it all came to a head. I was actually in the UK when this happened. So I was far away from my team, thousands of miles away. It's the middle of the night for me. You can't be mad at the ambush because it was done effectively. They knew what they were doing. And we get the word from our vendors that they're going to capitulate and withdraw our application, the whole thing. It's all about to blow up. And we get a last minute phone call. And they say, listen, nice exchange you have here. It'd be really a shame if something happened to it. I said, what do you mean? You're literally in the process of destroying my whole company. And they're like, well, it doesn't have to be this way. If you'll just change your listing standards to be the same as everybody else, all this can be made to go away. And that's when I finally understood what was really going on. And I gathered my team and I said, hey, everybody, here's the situation. I think if we say no to this offer, we're probably going bankrupt. But if we say yes, we're compromising our principles. So what should we do? And one by one, every person on that Zoom, and I'll never forget this. It was so late at night. I was bleary and delirious from this crazy situation. I was so stressed. Every person on my team, they just said, no deal. We'd rather go bankrupt than betray what we stand for. And I say in the book, I wish I could say it was my visionary leadership that got us through. But the truth is I was the one curled up on the bathroom floor. Like I could barely function. I was so upset. I thought the company was going to die to save a principal. Now, as it turned out, we did say no. They did withdraw our application. The whole thing fell apart and we had to start over from scratch. But as is often the case when you stand on principle, in retrospect, I can say this is one of the best things that ever happened to us. And the reason why LTSE exists at all today is because of the learning and the pivots we were able to get out of this ambush. But in the moment, and this is so key, in the moment, we didn't know what the consequence of sticking to our principles would be. And so we had to take the leap into the unknown. And I just think too many of our leaders are taught to compromise at the first sign of difficulty. They don't stand for their principles. And therefore, they never get the chance to unlock the incredible magnetic alignment that happens when you take the principled stand in business.
I don't think anybody ever regrets that. I'm sure there's probably financial considerations, all that kind of stuff. And the cognitive dissonance kicks in to justify the wrong.
Always, yes, of course.
But one of the challenges is, to call this out, I'm sure you've had this where I think when I read about this, I was thinking about great stories where founders stuck to their principles. Walt Disney, for example, when everybody said he was crazy making Snow White, then he was crazy making Disneyland, even though he'd succeeded massively on the previous pivot to Snow White, when doing a first feature film ever as an animation. Had you experienced that where somebody you thought would be there to support you actually wasn't and was like going, Eric, are you crazy, man?
So many people, I can't even tell you. And in fact, it's not just people who abandoned us or who kind of were like, a very large number of people would say to me, I'm so glad you're working on this problem. It's the most important problem in the world. Business has been struggling with quarterly reporting and the short-termism for 50 years. It's just about like, I really admire what you're doing. And I'd be like, oh, great. I'm so glad. Would you like to help us out? Maybe you'd like to invest. Maybe you'd like, we don't need your money, but even would you publicly endorse it? Even would you just like encourage your company to do it? Oh, no, absolutely not. Can't put my neck out. Glad that you're the one doing it. So yeah, I get that a lot. And I learned to become sympathetic to this, although as a founder, it's very frustrating. And yeah, Walt's folly, the whole thing, that's such a common pattern. And I tell a story like this in the book. It stems from two very different stories of what's happening with innovation that somehow coexist in the same organization, which I think is really fascinating. Story one is the founder hero story. So what is a company? Well, it begins with the founder, their vision, the business model, the strategy. That we build a team, they raise money, they gather resources, they figure this out. And the last step is they bring this thing to the market, customers buy it, validating their vision. And that's what makes a company create. But if you go to an economics class, you'll hear type story two, which is totally different. In story 2, what makes a company? Oh, well, a market need. The market has a need for a new thing. The customer demand summons an organization, and therefore its attendant network of business model and supplier relationships. That requires capital. So that attracts investors to provide the capital to do this thing. And because there's capital and there's this thing, we need employees to run it. And somebody has to be like the impresario who puts the whole thing together. But basically the founder is like the least important thing about what's happened, because the founder is basically privatizing gains that were created by the social structure that they live in. Now, what's so interesting to me about these two stories is they're the same story, but told backwards. One begins with founder, ends with customers, and the other begins with customers and ends with founder. So in an organization, you will find these both stories coexisting. The founder obviously believes in story 1, but many of their executives believe in story 2 because they weren't there when the company was just a scrappy little thing. They never saw the founder acting heroically. They showed up to a company that has always existed as far as they know. And so these two stories coexist because they're very, very, very similar. But when push comes to shove, they produce very different outcomes. If we have to take a bold bet on something new, the founders always tell me, like, I've said so many founders who've been like, I don't get it. Like Walt Disney, we're only here because of me in the first place. Why do I have to reprove myself? Like, surely the fact that I was right before should give you some level of belief that I'm right again. But from story 2, that's not true. The founder was just in the right place at the right time. They didn't really do anything. They were summoned by the market. So the frustrating thing about these two stories is that they are, in a very large degree, both true. And if you study the history of business, you will find that these stories actually lay out a hierarchy of business concepts, business model, culture, strategy, customer, and therefore almost every business theorist of the past has picked one of these levels of the story and made their whole career out of it. When they define what is a company, they'll be like, a company is a business model. It does this thing. What is a company? A company is a frictionless way of reducing the friction, of internalizing the friction of contracts. So like the contracting layer is what a company is. Other people will say, founder mode is what a company is. It's all about the vision and priority of the individual person. And it's like doctors who study a certain subsystem of the human body, who kind of like unconsciously start to think that their system is the most important. Like, why? If I study the heart, I'm like, the human being. The heart is the main thing, guys. How do I know? If you didn't have a heart, you would die. But the guy who studies the lungs is like, if you take the lungs out, you will also die. And the person being the nervous system to be like, excuse me, I actually command all these things, including the heart. And the guy who studies the brain is like, actually, guys, right? And we all have a natural tendency to think our piece of the whole is the whole. And the same thing is true for business. Most of us as leaders, most of us as business authors, for that matter, are focused on our system, our part, our piece. We don't see the whole. So as a result, we have this incomprehension, this confusion about what to do next, about where to bet, who to trust, that kind of stuff. And one of my goals with writing this book is to lay out a more comprehensive theory of what an organization actually is that encompasses both stories and all of these levels, so that we can start to see and develop techniques that address the holistic thing, the whole enterprise, whatever that thing is. And actually, the more you study what it is, the more wild it is. The more I think it's actually really utterly fascinating how many people are confused about what is the thing that they themselves operate.
Love it, man. Absolutely love it. And you reminded me of an Aesop fable, which is just, you set me up so beautifully for a nice segue. There's an Aesop fable called The Body and the Members, and it's about how the rest of the body turn on the stomach and think the stomach's not worth anything and get rid of it, and then the whole system dies. But it's a segue to the brilliant Golden Goose challenge that you set up in the book. And I'm going to share on the screen for those people watching us on YouTube a diagram I made, and it includes your quote there, if you can see, which I just absolutely love. Everything worth protecting will eventually need protection is a brilliant line that I'm gonna definitely stick it on one of those quote sites, man, to last forever. But for those people who are only listening to us, what it is, it's a boardroom, and it's a load of board members looking at the Golden Goose, and they're carving knives. They're getting ready for more and more and more, and they're about to butcher the goose.
Oh my God, that cartoon is painful to look at.
Yeah, it's horrible. And you talk about the two stories that companies tell themselves or are told, but there's two brilliant stories, contrasting stories, tragedies that you open up in chapter 1. The story of the legend who is Saul Price, and then the tragedy that is Robert Owen. I'd love you to juxtapose these.
Okay. Yeah. Happy to do it. Yeah. So let us begin with the legend of Saul Price, because Saul Price is a giant of entrepreneurship. I mean, and not that well known today, but in his day was very famous. He's really widely considered to be the father of modern retail. So to give you a sense of how influential his ideas were, when a guy named Sam Walton was thinking about getting into retail and was trying to decide what to name his company, he called it Walmart as an intentional tribute to Saul's company, FedMart. FedMart was the original American discount retailer. It was started by Saul Price in 1954 in San Diego. And Saul, before he became a retailer, was a lawyer. So when he was a lawyer, he was trained that he was a fiduciary to his client. What does that mean? Well, the lawyer is trained that you have to put the client's interest before your own. When he became a retailer, he asked himself this simple question: who's my client? And he thought it was really obvious that the customer is his client. So when he would operate, he said, everything we do has to be set to be a fiduciary to the customer. So for example, if competitors would sell products below FedMart's cost, Saul would put up signs saying, listen, you shouldn't buy this product from me. You can get it cheaper. And he would show exactly where you could get the product cheaper. I don't know how they're doing it below our cost, but you shouldn't buy it from me, buy it from them. He's like, my job is to put your interests ahead. So as a result, people really trusted FedMart and they liked shopping there. The company grew and thrived. He became a wealthy man. The company went public. But as a public company, he just felt this pressure all the time. He believed in low prices and high wages. He believed in hiring and promoting from within and a kind of an organic kind of growth. What did Wall Street want? Well, you can imagine the opposite. High prices and low wages, all the things you can get away with. If people trust you, the investor's perspective was you can betray them for money. They won't even notice because the trust is worth stealing. So Saul was an uncompromising person. And so this eventually came to a massive battle. One day in 1975, his board fired him. He literally came to work one day and he couldn't get into his office because they had changed the locks on his doors. And this is the pattern we see over and over and over again with companies that rediscover the principle that I call enlightened capitalism. Founders tend to treat enlightened capitalism like a technology. Like they're like, oh my God, I just invented something amazing. Did you know if you treat people with respect, if you pay good wages, if you invest in quality and R&D, if you are transparent and trustworthy with your customers, things go really well for you. You make all this money. And they say to people, look, because the market rewards value creation, because we live in a competitive system, the market will protect and not only share what I have created, and others will adopt it. And then something different happens. This has been going on a really long time. I tell what I call the tragedy of Robert Owen, the famous Scottish industrialist. He took over something called the New Lanark Mill in 1800. 1800. But he was so ahead of his time. He ended child labor. He upgraded on-site housing. He had a social insurance scheme. He provided health care for his workers, like all this stuff that by our modern standards, we would say is basically table stakes. He figured it out in 1800. He had very ahead of his time feedback practices for the workers. He ended corporal punishment. I mean, he had these very exceptional ideas and it really worked. He took this bankrupt mill to world-leading profitability and quality and all this good stuff. And his investors kept trying to fire him. He had to bring in new investors to buy out the old investors 3 times. One of the syndicates involved the great utilitarian philosopher, Jeremy Bentham. Okay. This was like not stupid people he was bringing in as investors, but every time the same problem would happen, the investors would fight with him about the right way to proceed, get into a conflict, and eventually they would try to oust him. On the 3rd try, they ultimately did. So when people hear the story of Saul Price or Robert Owen, they say to me, like, why? It's a kind of a mystery. Why would investors want to kill their own goose that laid the golden egg? Isn't the market supposed to be about value creation? Wouldn't investors want to make as much money as possible? This is one of the biggest fallacies of all time in business. The market does not reward value creation. For the record, you could create a market that rewarded value creation. We could live in that world if you want, but that's not the world we actually live in, nor has it been since 18. And because of the rise of financialization, this problem is obviously getting a lot worse. But let me go back to Saul Price, because this book is not meant to be depressing. It's actually a double mystery. Mystery number one is, why are we killing the golden goose? Why is this happening all over our economy, left and right? But if you ask most people about it, they will say, well, once you get past the denial of this doesn't happen, the markets are perfectly rational, investors don't do this. But we lay out hundreds of years of case studies. People are like, okay, it does happen. You say, why? Well, I guess it's inevitable. When companies get big, when there's money involved, human nature, whatever. We have a lot of just so stories about why this is inevitable. But if it's inevitable, this is the second mystery. Why are there exceptions? Let's go back to Saul Price one more time. Saul Price, after he got fired, he was a late in life entrepreneur, and he was rich now. So he could easily have just retired and been like, that's basically what happened to Robert Owen. He gave up on business as a tool for change, but not Saul. Saul was very stubborn. He took 2 weeks off, and then he was back at work. He leased the office upstairs from FedMart and started a new company. Now, today that company, which he called the Price Company, is not that well known. But like when I was a kid, the Price Club was like the store that my family shopped at. I didn't even know that Price was a guy's name. I just thought it's the store with the low prices. That's where you go. But today, Price Club is not that well known because of something else that happened right around the same time. See, Saul was a big believer in promoting from within. So there was a guy who had started with him as a stock boy at FedMart and then had risen through the ranks all the way to an executive. His name was Jim Sinegal. And he quit FedMart in protest when Saul was fired, went to help Saul build Price Club up, and then he decided to start his own company. That company, some years later, merged with Price Club to form a company that they called Price Costco. But of course, we just call Costco the $400 billion public company that is, for whatever reason, the exception to every business rule. So if this is inevitable, like if what happened to FedMart and New Lanark is inevitable, why hasn't it happened to Costco? People say, well, I guess Costco's just too big. Wall Street wouldn't dare mess with them. Are you kidding me? No way. Wall Street is constantly trying to get Costco to abandon the ethos that it has. It still practices that fiduciary to the customer mindset, the capped margins of Saul Price. But Jim Sinegal added a second really important element. Costco is protected by a governance fortress that prevents its board from betraying the mission and prevents outsiders from forcing the board to do so. And Costco is not alone. There are these outlier companies all over our economy that seem to defy this rule. And in fact, if you study those companies as a set, you will notice something very striking. Every single one of them basically completely defies every single one of the so-called best practices we are teaching everybody about how they're supposed to build their companies. So that's the book, A Double Mystery. Why does this happen? And how can we create exceptions that prove the rule?
Man, I got through that much of my notes.
Yeah. All right, we'll have more to discuss. I look forward to it.
I know you're under time pressure. I want to just tell our audience, in chapter 1, for those of you who like innovation, Eric gives a list of unusual failures. There's a link to the book where you can sign up to the website. I'm going to link you to that so you can go and download that. You'll get emails once the book is released. There's a plethora of content to go along with this. Really interesting. I loved your taxonomy of the mechanisms of those failures, which is really useful language I found in my work as innovation as well. Love that. That's all in chapter 1. But Eric, I love your mission. I love how you've reinvented yourself. I love what you've done. You've gone from being the animator to developing the Disneyland and going for a bigger mission, just like Walt did. I'm sure people said it was Reese's folly, and I'm really behind you with this mission. There's a beautiful saying I'm going to leave you with, a Greek proverb, and it's that societies grow great when old men plant trees under whose shade they'll never sit. I know you're not old, but thank you for planting trees. Eric Ries, thank you for joining us.
That is awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate your kind words, and what a great note to end it on. Thank you.
With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com.